Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to the drum taps section of Leaves of Grass, and maybe we'll not only call it Talks with Walt, but we'll call Tears with Walt. This is, if Whitman thought he was creating the New American Bible, as we've said in previous lectures, for sure, the section we call Drum Taps, and then the section to follow, Memories of Lincoln, will be the section that would be referred to as the Lamentation section of the New American Bible. There's no question that these 43 poems are going to be for us difficult to read, challenging for us to read on so many levels, and yet I would argue necessary to read. These are the poems that will be the response by Whitman to the Great Civil War. Now, our assumptions here will begin with that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, as we say, is our playlist. And from the very beginning, that very first word, come, it's almost as if you pick up Leaves of Grass and you just read it all the way through, as we've been doing, you will find yourself, when you hit drum taps, imagining that maybe this was the whole point. And maybe in the end it was all culminating to poem 21 in the of the 43 poems at Drum Taps, The Wound Dresser. Do you guys remember at the very beginning, I kind of forecasted this for you, but do you remember at the very beginning, we stumbled across in the inscription section, to thee old cause. Do you remember these lines? To thee old cause, thou peerless, passionate, good cause, thou stern, remorseless, sweet idea, deathless throughout the ages, races, lands, after a strange, sad war, great war for thee. And then in parenthetics, I think all war through time was really fought and ever will be really fought for thee. These chants for thee, the eternal march of thee. A war, O soldiers, not for itself alone. Far, far more stood silently waiting behind now to advance in this book. Thou orb of many orbs, thou seething principle, thou well-kept latent germ, thou center, around the idea of thee, the war revolving, with all its angry and vehement play of causes, with vast results to come for thrice 1,000 years, these recitatives for thee, my book, and the war are one. Merged in its spirit, I and mine, as the contest hinged on thee, as a wheel on its axis turns, this book, unwitting to itself, around the idea of thee. Now, I just want to point out the ways in which, if you've been reading, and I hope, annotating your volume, that poem, which we started with at the very beginning, is one that now has to be read quite differently, far more profoundly, deeply. Now, our assumptions, as we will remind you, is that our learning theory is constantly trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. As we have often said, the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW. And it, I think, is powerful for us today, given the political context. I'm now giving this lecture in the month of, right at the end of October, the beginning of November, before the midterms of 2022. There's a lot of political discourse that harks back to the American Civil War. Every once in a while, you'll even hear somebody say, well, maybe it's time for another civil war. And you can just imagine that Whitman is going to say, before you go there, read Drum Taps. But before you read Drum Taps, I would challenge you to read everything that precedes it, and you will begin to see what we will call here in a few moments a sustained theodicy, as we've been talking about it. Our annotative approach, just to remind you, is that we will look always to try and answer three guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? And at level 3, how can I relate to the text in some meaningful way? At level 1, summarizing what the text says. We'll do that for every one of these poems. And then at 2A, themes and messages, and at 2B, the rhetoric, the literary techniques, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it, and we'll study the language of the poetry. At 3A, we'll try to relate what we're studying to other titles and other texts we're familiar with, obviously other texts from Leaves of Grass, and the echoes are going to be pretty profound in this section of poems. And then finally, and I think most importantly, because of our learning theory, we have to try to own each one of these poems, relate it to ourselves, and I hope that is something that you continue to do through your study of Drum Tap section. Now, Also to remind our big five, every one of these texts we will ask, what does this text say about epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, and then that final word that I used a moment ago, theodicy, just to remind. Epistemology, what does the text say about knowledge and what we can know? Ontology, what does the text say about who we are as people? Obviously we're bodies, but we're so much more than that. And then psychology and sociology are, of course, two sides of the same coin. Psychology, the study of the individual mind, the study of the anxieties and the fears, the motivations, and then sociology, the study of the collective mind and those motivations. We're going to do a lot of dancing between those four to provide us with the final of our big five, the question of theodicy. I think that there's a whole lot that we have to say about Milton and Dante and Milton to be exact in the order, if we're really going to read drum taps correctly. Why? Because Dante teaches us, and we've given full lectures on Paradise Lost as well as the Inferno and the Divine Comedy. What is it that we've said that we learned from our study of Dante? You don't go to hell, you go through hell. And certainly, no question, Whitman is going to be playing that game out in spades for us in this precious section of 43 poems. Now we've talked about Whitman as not Whitman, but Whitmans. There's more than five, but we're concentrating on five, as you'll recall. We're very interested in Whitman as person. His biography really matters for these poems. Why? Because in December of '62, he found himself on the Virginia front or close to it, and then looking for his brother George, who had been wounded. And so much of the experience of the war will be about his biography as person. Of course, as poet, no question. When Whitman arrives to see the first things he sees, he's just horrified, but as a poet, he's going to begin to describe it in the most amazing of language. I think this is the finest war poetry ever written. I'll try and make that argument as we go. I have also said, the third P, that Whitman starts out as a teacher. We call it a pedagogue here to just get our P's straight, but the truth of the matter is, I think Whitman never left that first love of trying to educate, trying to teach, and I think Drum Taps is designed, intentionally designed, as a propedeutic, instructional, didactic. Of course, Whitman is politician in his celebration of democracy. No question. We're going to pick up with this constantly, right from the very beginning, because we're going to go through all of the emotions that Whitman himself went through as it relates to the Civil War. First, it was a certain kind of energy of excitement that quickly, of course, led to a certain kind of dread, and then finally a kind of resignation of the entire project. And then finally, and I think this will take us back to the question of theodicy, Whitman as philosopher. He was very influenced by Socrates up through Emerson, and we're going to see it time and again that he continues to play. I mean, in our last conversation by the Roadside Poems, we pointed out that Whitman was very influenced by the philosophy of Hegel and the idea of the dialectic and the struggle. He obviously is going to try and play that game out. Now, we have said the very best approach, and I think I want to say it again here, is for you to read these poems on your own. You try and work through them, especially if you've been working with us all the way from the very first word come, all the way through inscriptions, all the way up through the preceding poems of Roadside, and of course that last poem of Roadside, which tells us Whitman had this sense something really tragic was about to happen, and he was deeply concerned about the loss and the lack of leadership. Obviously, he welcomed Lincoln as a man who maybe would get us through this experience. If you've been working through all of that, then I very much recommend that you start these poems on your own. Work with them on your own, and then come to our comments to help you. Now, a couple of scholars before we get to our Nortons, I'm going to be drawing on heavily here. I'll be working with Roy Morris's The Better Angel, Walt Whitman in the Civil War, and David S. Reynolds' classic, Walt Whitman's America, a Cultural Biography. Both of these are going to be significant for us. Let's turn now to our Nortons to hear what Nortons has to say about this collection of 43 poems. Whitman's earliest reference is Norton's. Whitman's earliest reference to drum taps is in a letter of March 31, 1863, in which he asked his mom to look after the manuscript, but he was at work on some of the poems by 1860 or earlier. When he was considering the printing of a collection, Banner at Daybreak, some of whose titles were later identified as drum taps poems. Whitman said drum taps was, quote, put together by fits and starts on the field, in the hospitals, as I worked with the soldier boys, unquote. And after much persistence against odds, he sent the book to press May 1865. The first issue was a thin book of 72 pages containing 53 poems. one of which was the short 12-line, "Hushed be the camps today." We'll obviously get to it, about the burial of Lincoln. The great Lincoln elegy, "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed," was the first of 18 more poems published as sequel to Drum Taps since the preceding came from the press, end quote. And bound into the second issue of Drum Taps, 500 copies were printed. The reviews were comparatively few and unenthusiastic, notably those by two bright young men of the future, William Dean Howells and Henry James. Just turned 28 and 22 years, respectively. So young critiquers, the two young critiquers, they got it. They understood something important is happening here. Back to Norton's. Such a response saddened Whitman, who, as he told O'Connor, felt that Drum Taps was superior as a work of art to Leaves of Grass. Despite the distinction, Whitman was profoundly aware that Drum Taps was a part of Leaves of Grass, that indeed the experience of the war had given identity and homogeneity to the whole. He was to say as much years later in a backward glance. Because of its subject matter, Drum Taps preserved more autonomy through the successive editions of Leaves of Grass than most of the groups, despite many changes, as the notes indicate. From the first, the group was not limited to war poems. At least 20 of the 71 poems in Drum Taps and in the sequel having nothing to do with the theme suggested by the title, and these, notably out of the rolling ocean, the crowd, and chanting the square deific, were after 1865 and 66 placed elsewhere. And we commented on this several times in our study of Roadside, right? Of the 53 Drum Tap poems of 1865, only 29 are retained in the final 1881 grouping, and of the 18 poems of the sequel, only 9 are retained. The others were shifted more often than once to other groups to put the situation another way. The 43 poems now in Drum Taps, 38 were either in the original Drum Taps or in the sequel, and only 5 originated elsewhere. In his final arrangement, the poet attained a concentration not before achieved. And I think that is huge for us to point out. Now, how are we going to look specifically at this collection of poems? Well, the first thing we'll say is that Morris points out in his very first line of his treatment that the Civil War saved Whitman. Why? Well, he was in what Morris calls spiraling depression. Whitman himself called it quicksand years that whirl me I know not whither, end quote. And the truth is that Morris argues for all of the breadth and variety of friendships that Whitman had, he was essentially a lonely man. And at the beginning of the war, he will leave Brooklyn, never to return to live there again, and he will find himself blown away by what he discovers. Let me just share a bit of reading from Morris. As Whitman arrives in Pennsylvania, a soldier who had spent 50 hours lying wounded on the battlefield, unable even to lift his head, he says, in the meantime, the rebel marksman enjoyed an uninterrupted turkey shoot, blasting away at anything, human or animal, that dared to move on the battlefield. By the time the first relief parties reached the scene, hundreds of wounded Union soldiers had joined the ranks of the frozen dead. They lay, said one witness, quote, and now I'm quoting, in every conceivable position, some on their backs with gaping jaws, some with eyes as large as walnuts protruding with glassy stares, some doubled up like a contortionist. Here lay one without a head, there one without legs, yonder a head and legs without a trunk. Everywhere horrible expressions, fear, rage, agony, madness, torture, lying in pools of blood, lying with heads half buried in mud, with fragments of shells sticking in oozing brain and with bullet holes all over the puffed limbs. End quote. It's a hard passage to read. And yet I think as we begin, we have to understand where we're about to head. That informed optimism, as I've called it in earlier lectures, will now give place to a certain kind of vision of reality. Why? Well, everything for us, as I said already, is going to build towards poem 21, The Wound Dresser, because Whitman spent the years of the war helping, conservatively, the estimate is at least 80,000, both Union as well as Confederate soldiers, as he was nursing them in the hospitals. From his comment in Specimen Days, he will argue that the dominant metaphor of the entire war was the hospital. And we're going to see how this is played out, and the idea that the hospital becomes kind of an idea of the great challenge of trying to get people through. Of course, as we said, Whitman's brother George is wounded, and in December of 1862, he ends up on the Virginia battlefront. Now, whether he made it actually to the battlefront or not, it's not totally clear. We think probably he did. And what he saw was things like I just read, and it just blew him away. He couldn't believe it. He will say, however, about this horrific experience, and as we now begin to read our poems from Drum Taps, I want this to stay in the back of my mind. This is what Whitman says about those 3 years of hell. I mentioned Dante. Those 3 years, he said, I consider the greatest privilege and satisfaction, the most profound lesson of my life. It aroused and brought out a decided, undreamed of depth of emotion. Wow. Well, here we have it in Drum Taps. I think what he says at the beginning, to thee, O cause, I think the way he put this final deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass together, it is intentionally designed to bring us to these poems. And we will, what? We will approach them with, I hope, reverence and grace. I want to give to them every bit of the attention that we've given to every single line before. And in the end, I hope that we are reading this set of lines as what I think Whitman meant for it to be, among other things, a propaedeutic. The next time that you hear someone say, well, maybe it's time for America to just engage in another civil war, if you've read these poems, you will say, before we go there, let's pick up Whitman and let's have a chat with Whitman. And then maybe we'll be a little more cautious in our rhetoric. Thank you.